our options here. Works for the School of Accounting, the executive programs within the College of Business for the past 11 years. Michael graduated from the University of South Florida with 2 undergraduate degrees in history and social science education, pursues that love of history even today. Received an MBA in finance from Palm Beach Atlantic University and earned a Master of Accounting degree from FAU. So his personal interests include history, politics, and religion, and how they interact. So we'll have about a 15-minute presentation kind of walking us through the Electoral College, its logic, its illogical functioning, and I'll talk for just a few brief moments about some different alternative systems, and then leave the floor with you. So without further ado, let me introduce Michael.
Thank you. So the title of the presentation is Past, Present, Future of the Electoral College. What I want to do is evaluate the Electoral College in a prism of its morality. Is it consistent and is it fair? So a famous person once tweeted, the Electoral College is a disaster for democracy. So the proposition before us today is he right? Is the Electoral College a disaster for democracy? Before we go into it, we have to know what is the Electoral College. It's a relatively small group of people chosen from each state to elect a president. Right now, you have 538 electors, and the president has to earn 270 of that. And the number of electoral votes for each state is decided by the number of representatives added to the number of senators. So for example, for Florida, we have 29, right? So that's 27 representatives plus the 2 senators gives us the 29 electoral votes. And that's basically the Electoral College and choosing the president. Now the question is, why the Electoral College? Well, for the framers, they felt, this is again their frame of mind, they felt it was a better alternative to direct vote, right? The framers believed that at the time, remember this is in 1787, they believed that someone from South Carolina could never understand someone from New York, that someone from Massachusetts couldn't understand someone from Georgia, that the common man did not have the capacity or knowledge or experience to elect someone to a national office. Also, secondary, people like James Madison was also concerned about free whites in the North being able to outvote free whites in the South. He also thought it was a better alternative to congressional vote. Some thought that the Congress should elect the president, but then they also thought, well, that could lead to corruption. It would muddy the separation of powers, and they would think that the president would be beholden to Congress. And they also felt, with the Electoral College, they felt they were going to pick men who were independently minded. They felt that these men would have the experience and the knowledge and the discernment to pick the president. So then they felt, according to Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Papers 68, that these individuals would always pick the president who had the requisite qualifications, high morals and high stature. Morality, okay, is the Electoral College moral? And then we have to think to ourselves, where do our morals come from when it comes to politics? I'd say the first is the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, okay? I think that's our first moral foundation, is that all men are created equal. Secondly, it's the preamble of the US Constitution, we the people. So we have all men are created equal, and we the people. And how does that inspirational ideas, those inspirational ideas, how do they inform us throughout the centuries? Well, in one way, it's about voting rights expansion, right? So there's about 4 discriminations, right, that occurred at the dawn of our republic. One was economic discrimination, right? So the people in the original 13 states that could vote, they either had to own property or they had to pay taxes depending on the state, okay? By 1828, by the time Andrew Jackson's elected, there's universal suffrage among white males. So it doesn't have to be necessarily tax paying or property owning, they could also be poor whites as well. So that's economic discrimination. Then as we move forward in time, we also have to deal with racial discrimination, right? Because it's we the people, right? So the 15th Amendment allows African American males the right to vote. Now, as we all know, right, it takes about another 100 years for African Americans to actually be able to use the 15th. Then, let's move forward. We have gender discrimination, right? So part of we the people is we want to eliminate economic discrimination, racial discrimination, and now we have gender discrimination, right? Because when all men are created equal in 1776, it probably meant men, right, and not women. So by the 19th Amendment, all women are allowed to vote in 1920. And the last discrimination would be like ageism, right? So then we jump to the Vietnam War. You have 18-year-olds that are able to die for this country, but they can't vote to change the policies. So in 1971, 18-year-olds and over are allowed to vote. Okay, so now we look at morality that as the centuries go on, we want to expand our voting rights, right? We want to give more people the right to vote. Then we have to look at consistency. Is the Electoral College consistent with the rest of our country with how it votes? City mayors are elected by popular vote. For example, I would say the closest analogy to the Electoral College would be New York City, right? They have 5 boroughs, right? Mayor de Blasio, elected by popular vote. He didn't have to go to Manhattan and say, I need these electoral votes, or I need to go to Brooklyn and get these electoral votes. All 5 boroughs voted by popular vote to elect Mayor de Blasio. State governors are also popularly elected. So for example, let's take the state of Florida, right? Some people say, well, you know, if you eliminate the Electoral College, what about the cities? Won't the cities run the country? Well, let's take Florida, right? We have Miami, right? We have South Florida. But Rick Scott is he's been elected twice. How did that happen? Well, because not all cities are as liberal as others, right? That's a stereotype, right? You have Orlando and Tampa and Jacksonville. It's also about turnout, right? So in 2010, Rick Scott won partly because he got the North Floridian vote more than, say, the South Floridian vote went out to vote. So popular vote doesn't necessarily mean that the rural will always be subservient to the urban. U.S. representatives are also popular vote. And as of 1913, the U.S. senators are also direct vote. In the body of the U.S. Constitution, it was the state legislatures that chose the U.S. senators, not the people. Today, we directly elect our U.S. senators. And then I think lastly, and most importantly, is the Supreme Court case Baker v. Carr. See, part of our principles of voting is it's one man, one vote, right? Regardless where you live, regardless where you grew up, it's always one man, one vote. This is enshrined in the Supreme Court case Baker v. Carr, where in Tennessee, they wanted to keep the rural in power. And so for 60 years, they didn't really change their voting districts. So registered voters went up by 4 times from 1901 to 1961. And there was also a demographic shift from the rural to the urban, but the politicians still wanted to keep their power. And so Baker v. Carr said, you cannot do that everyone's vote has to be equal. And so that's the question for us. Does the Electoral College even go by Baker v. Carr? Is every person's vote in the United States treated as equal? Lastly, then, if we look at the morality, if we look at the consistency, we have to think of fairness. Is the Electoral College fair? Especially if the trajectory of our republic is to a more inclusive democracy, right? We all know that in 1787, it wasn't a perfect democracy. We know that today we're not a perfect democracy, but I think we're heading in the right direction as the centuries go on. So let me go over the 5 elections where the Electoral College reversed the popular vote. And before I go on to, I want to talk about the 1800 election real quick. In 1800 was the first time you had running mates, right? And the Electoral College didn't think of running mates. The idea was the person who got the most electoral votes would be president, the runner-up would be vice president. That's how it was in 1796. John Adams became president, Thomas Jefferson became vice president. Okay? By 1800, Thomas Jefferson has a running mate, Aaron Burr. Okay? And the Electoral College does not have a capacity to vote for vice president that way. So Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr got the same amount of votes. And Aaron Burr was like, why can't I be president? I want to be president too. So that created a conflict. Out of that came the 12th Amendment, where the electors vote for president and the electors also vote for vice president. So 1824 is the first time that well, this is kind of unique because Andrew Jackson actually won the popular vote and he won the Electoral College. Well, no, he didn't win the Electoral College. He got the most electoral votes. Problem is, with the Electoral College, you have to win the majority. If you don't win the majority, it's thrown into the House of Representatives, right? So, Andrew Jackson won the popular vote. He won the most electoral votes, but it was thrown into the House of Representatives, and it was given to John Quincy Adams. Okay? And the idea behind the Electoral College was to not have corruption. Well, you have the corrupt bargain of 1824, when seemingly John Quincy Adams gives Henry Clay the Secretary of State position once John Quincy Adams gets the presidency. So there you can see where the Electoral College fails to live up to its standard of ending corruption. Next one, 1876. Okay? This is the election that ends Reconstruction. Here we have Hayes beating out Tillman. And what's really ironic is Florida is a problem because in trying to get the Electoral College votes, Florida certifies twice. The first time for Tillman, the second time for Hayes, and then when Congress is, picking the votes, they have to determine which certification to go with, and they went with Hayes. The third is 1888. Benjamin Harrison. Again, Cleveland wins the popular vote, but Harrison wins the Electoral College. (2000). We all know that's in our living memory. Again, Al Gore wins the popular vote, and George Bush wins the Electoral College. And lastly, 2016. And one reason why I chose this graphic is that you can kind of see, because part of Electoral College is that it's a winner-take-all. The states decide that. So in Florida, look how close Florida is between a Democrat and a Republican, right? Trump got all 29, right? Because it's winner-take-all. Look how close Texas is. California is not too bad either. So you see across the country that there's a split between Democrats and Republicans, but the Electoral College can never express this. It can never show this because of the winner-take-all idea that each state does, except for Nebraska and Maine. Now, if it was proportional, there would still be another problem, because if either Secretary of State Clinton or current President Trump couldn't get a majority of the 270, it'd be thrown into the House of Representatives anyway, and that still, I would say, is undemocratic. So, in conclusion, we have to look back at what the tweet said. The Electoral College is a disaster for democracy. And I would propose that because of our moral foundation of we the people, and all men are created equal, and it's inconsistent with how we vote in our state and local governments, and even our federal offices, except for the president. And it doesn't seem fair from a democratic point of view. I would say that the Electoral College, I would agree with President Trump and say that the Electoral College is a disaster for democracy.
So I think that Michael's laid out a case, an ethical case, as well as a institutional case showing that the Electoral College, even if you think it's a moral institution, ethical institution, sometimes just doesn't function as it's supposed to. So then I guess the issue before us is, okay, if that's the case, then what do we substitute it for? What system would we adopt rather than having the Electoral College? And what's interesting is that if you look at a lot of the institutions of the United States, whether it's federalism, whether it's presidentialism, you'll see that these models that we have created have been adopted globally, especially in the global South. You'll see that presidential systems are very popular. Federalism as a division of power is very popular. Globally, what's interesting is there's no other country in the world that utilizes the Electoral College. We're unique in that, in both the adoption of the Electoral College and sustaining the Electoral College. So, so what other types of systems are out there? And again, I think Michael has kind of mentioned them a little bit when he looked at kind of local elections and some alternatives to the Electoral College. The most obvious alternative is the one that he described when he was talking about the system oftentimes for the election of mayors or for other types of officials, and that's what we call plurality. And plurality is what we're very much used to. He talked about winner-take-all, right? No matter what percentage of the vote you get, whoever gets the most votes wins. So that's the whole notion of plurality. And again, there's about 20 countries worldwide that use this particular system for the direct election of the president. And as you see, kind of look at this list, you'll see that while there are certainly some important democracies that are listed here, not a lot of countries globally that have presidential systems use this form of plurality, and certainly not a lot of the countries that we're most familiar with that really have the direct election of the president. So even though this is one option that's out there, it's not widely adopted. And it's curious because if you think about it, for when you're designing electoral systems, there are certain types of ways in which we try to think about how do we judge what is a better system than another? Because it's of course relative in terms of what you want the system to do. One of the advantages of plurality, it's very easy for voters to understand. If you tell a voter, look, whoever gets the most votes wins, it's very simple for them to understand. And even though that might seem very straightforward, this notion of simplicity is actually highly beneficial, because if you think about the Electoral College and how convoluted it is, that would, for people who design electoral systems, they would argue that that sort of complication, the convolution of it, and the lack of understanding means that you can get unintended consequences because people vote in ways they don't necessarily know how those votes are going to translate. Another advantage that the literature points to is that, again, the kind of winner-take-all notion, right, favors large parties over smaller parties. And of course, that's also one of the explanations for why we have the two-party system in the United States, the notion of winner-take-all, not, of course, presidential elections, but for elections for the House and for the Senate, so that you have less likely party fragmentation to occur. With all those advantages, the reasons why globally, at least, you don't see a lot of countries move towards the direct election is, ironically enough, the exact thing that we just talked about. For many countries, the argument is that if you really want to maximize representation, this sort of plurality winner-take-all system that leads to large parties values stability, but you don't get very much representation. And so that's considered oftentimes one of the real weaknesses of moving to this form of election of the president. And finally, one of the other arguments that's made, and we've heard this in discussions, I can remember even going back to the Clinton victory. If you think about, Ross Perot was the last really kind of major third-party candidate we had running for election, in which we found that there was no candidate actually received an overall majority of the vote. Clinton received just in the 40s, actually, at that point in time because of Ross Perot. And so some people argued that he was not as legitimate because he had not received, a mandate, from the people, because mandates are associated with at least 50% of the people agreeing with it. So it could very well be in some countries, and we see this actually, that individuals could win an election and maybe only receive 35% of the vote. So it's an open question whether people would regard that person as having a mandate, as legitimately representing the people, if they actually only got a minority of the vote. We're not talking the case of the cases that Michael presented, which were extremely close elections, we're talking about maybe 10 or 15 percentage points away from majority. So the most popular system out there to elect a president for direct election purposes, and we should mention, many countries, of course, have parliamentary systems in which the president is either, even if they're directly elected, have very little power, if they're not directly elected. So there's a lot of different options out there, but if we keep with the current structure of our system of government, the one that is most preferred globally is called majoritarianism. And this is the electoral system in which a candidate must receive over 50% of the vote. If no candidate receives 50% of the vote, then you have a runoff election 2 weeks later between the top two vote getters. So then that way, again, you are, if you think about it, if you have an election in the second round between the top two vote getters, you're guaranteed that someone's going to be a majority vote getter. Hence, that's why the system is called majoritarianism. If you look at the list of countries that use this, forgive me for its fairly long and it's a little bit smaller font, but as you see, compared to the plurality system, majoritarianism is by far the most globally favored system that we have. And importantly, if you were to look, again, if we were to go back to the previous slide, we were looking at presidential systems, for instance, in Europe, you would see almost no country in Europe, for instance, that directly elects the president uses plurality. But the countries that do have a direct election of the president in Europe, for instance, Finland, France is the best example we can use the system of majoritarianism. And it'd be I didn't do this analysis here, but it'd be very interesting to kind of look at what are the Freedom House scores or the democracy indicators for these countries versus countries that use this alternative type of system. But it doesn't take a social scientist or someone to parse out statistics to realize that if you're going to be adopting majoritarianism, it seems that you'd be in company of a large group of countries that have really adopted it. So why is the white country's favorite? Well, again, the most obvious reason is that no candidate can win without having a majority of the vote. This notion of the mandate is just a given because of the mathematical probabilities of having just the two candidates in this kind of second round runoff. The other argument, it's a more nuanced argument for our purposes, but what you typically find, for instance, in France, right? France began the system of majoritarianism. It actually originated in the French Fifth Republic. And voters oftentimes know that there's almost always going to be two rounds of voting. It's because if you don't secure 50% in the first round, there's going to be a runoff. And so therefore, what we find is that individuals in the first round they vote sincerely, as we'd say. They would maybe vote for a smaller party candidate, knowing that almost always there's going to be a second round of voting. So one of the advantages is that, again, you can vote sincerely in the first round, vote for whomever you want, right? Knowing that how in the United States we always talk about, well, you can't vote for a third party because if you vote for a third party, you're wasting your vote, right? Well, here you can vote for a third party, knowing that you still have an opportunity 2 weeks later to vote for a major party candidate, given the fact that most of the time it's those major party candidates that enter the second round. So therefore, you still have some form of representation. You have a proliferation of parties, especially at that first round. But you still have kind of the stability that goes with the second round. And finally, one of the strengths, it's argued at least, is that this can lead to negotiations which involves consensus building. And here, the argument is that oftentimes you'll see, especially if you were to look at French elections, in that first round, you'll see that there's a pretty good division of the votes among 3, 4, maybe potentially even 5 candidates. So the real politics occurs between that first election, right, and the runoff second election. And that's when you really start seeing a lot of this consensus building. And there's an argument in the literature that argues that these forms of negotiation actually leads to a greater enhancement of democracy because you have some vote trading so that smaller parties, smaller candidates can have more of an impact. And therefore, that's why you see the maintenance sometimes in many of these countries of these smaller parties compared to the US. Well, of course, there's disadvantages to majoritarianism. Most obvious, again, for many people is that these large parties still have an advantage over smaller parties. So for those of you in the audience who value representation and lament the fact that the United States has just simply a two-party system where we don't really have the diversity of representation that you find in many countries, Majoritarianism is maybe not going to solve your problems because at the end of the day, you would probably still find it's going to be a Republican and a Democrat that's going to make it to that second round. You're not going to see a three-party candidate or some sort of alternative third-party candidate where you maybe necessarily make it to the second round. The other disadvantage that people point to is that if you really think about at the end of the day, that person who wins in the second round, the reality is if you poll people, that person never actually got a majority of the vote. Right? If you look back to that first round, oftentimes, sometimes people who in the first round actually got less vote than anyone else can still win the election in the second round, so that you get manufactured majorities. These are not real majorities. They're not really representing the people. They're created because of the electoral system that has been designed. So these are just a couple of different options that are out there. And I just mention these because at the end of the day, while many of us may agree that the Electoral College is really a vestige of a long, long period, globally no other country uses it. If we all agree on that, then the question is, what do we replace it with? And that's where you see the devil sometimes is in the details. So with that, I'll leave it for questions for Michael, for you to get you better.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on what the Henry Clay corruption issue was for that one particular election?
Right. Well, the House of Representatives really didn't like Andrew Jackson. Because Andrew Jackson was thought to be a man of the people. John Quincy Adams was a lot more qualified. I mean, Secretary of State under the Monroe administration. He's kind of credited for the Monroe Doctrine. He was a child prodigy as well, son of John Adams. So as they were politicking, trying to get the votes, there was, a rumor that he promised Henry Clay, who was really influential, and he would become Speaker of the House.
So when it was going back to the House, that was
yeah, and then John Quincy Adams got the presidency, Henry Clay got Secretary of State. Because the idea back then was Secretary of State would lead you to the presidency. Like Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State, and other people were Secretary of State and became president. So,
Specifically, who are the electors? Who chooses them? How are they chosen? What's the criteria?
Well, originally it was state legislatures, and now it seems to be that party loyalists, as long as they're not in the House of Representatives and as long as they're not in the U.S. Senate, and so it seems like people who are loyal to the dominant party of the state.
And so the party does the choosing?
Yeah.
Each party?
It seems like, yeah, because again, the Constitution was written without parties in mind, right? So parties did not exist at the time. So the idea was you would represent your state. But as we see that over time, politicians represent their party, not necessarily their state. And I think inside the state's the same thing. Because like, for example, I want to say Joe Negron was an elector. And, I think he tweeted that a lot of people are emailing him, please vote for someone else. Please vote for someone else. He's like, I'm not. I'm going to vote my duty. So it's like the idea of the independent elector's gone because of the winner-take-all. And then also I would say the partisan politics.
Yeah, to go to your question, each of the parties will vet and then they draw up a list of their electors. So long before the election night who the electors are for each party. They're just simply waiting to see what the popular vote is going to be, and then they file those individuals' names with the state legislature, and then that's when they actually go to vote. And as Michael was saying, again, one of the other, though it doesn't happen very often, but it can happen where the electors, they're not required to vote for the candidate of their party that wins the election, that has won the popular vote, and so therefore the faithless elector is always a possibility. It doesn't happen very often, but that's another abnormality, if you will, with the electoral college.
So, like, if how would be the process to change to like eliminate the electoral college, what would be the process? Who would be like? Who would they go to change that?
Well, right now, I guess that, well, there's one main choice, and that is an amendment to the Constitution, because the Electoral College is in the body of the Constitution, and then the 12th Amendment reinforces the Electoral College. So it would have to be an amendment to the Constitution. But also, right now, there's a movement. I think it's called the National Popular Vote Plan, and the idea there is, I think 10 states, I think, have passed it. And that's the idea that if no matter who wins your state, whoever wins the popular vote, those electoral votes goes to the popular vote. So there are people who are trying to get all 50 states to adopt this plan. But I'm thinking, isn't that just as hard as maybe getting a constitutional amendment passed? But that's how it would go, I think.
Yeah, like people who don't want to change, don't want to leave the electoral college. What are their main arguments? Like, why we should keep it?
Okay, right. Well, there's quite a few. One, and I think this goes back to a tradition. Part of the tradition in the United States, I think, is to protect minority rights and protect minority voices. And so I think that's kind of where it's coming from, where I hear, oh, I don't want California and New York to pick the president. I don't want the cities, the urban areas to pick the president. What about the rural areas? So that tends to be the main arguments. But I do think, based on the little pie charts in 2016, it shows that this country are not really separated between red and blue, is that you have a combination of each. And so let's say you're in California and you live in Kevin McCarthy's district or Devin Nunes's district, you might get more excited as a Republican that you might see a Republican candidate actually campaign in California, right? You might actually see a Democratic candidate actually campaign in Texas. So I think that could be a stereotype that might not come true.
Plus, it could also be small states worried about being overrun by big states.
Right. That's true. And I also think that the evolution of our country is very different now, right? So in 1787, we had very, very powerful states, right? Under the Articles of Confederation, you had your militia, you could have your currency, right? The Continental Congress basically had to ask states for money when they were fighting in the Revolutionary War, But that has changed over time, and I would especially say that since the Civil War, we're more American. Like, I think most of us consider ourselves Americans first and our states second. Whereas in the Civil War, you have a Massachusetts regiment, you might have a Kentucky regiment, an Ohio regiment. But then in Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam and in Korea and World War II, you wouldn't see the Floridian regiment, running in Europe. You didn't see that.
We changed the way that we elected U.S. senators here in the U.S.
Yes.
Back in 1913. Do you see any similarities, and how hard was it to do that? Is there anything from back then that we can adapt in today's?
Yeah, well, I think it was a great time because during the age of the progressive era, and the idea was that there were political cartoons everywhere. You guys probably all seen it in school, where you have like senators big and fat, and it says oil across his chest. So the idea was that these guys were bought by industry, right? And the legislatures were setting up corrupt people. So the idea was then that if you had the people directly elected senators, that could eliminate corruption. And so there was that fervor. It was that action. And you have some amendments go quickly, and then you have other amendments take decades. So I guess it depends. I think it was the era at the time that really got that. Yes.
One of the importance for the Electoral College are that, or I should say, the reason behind having an Electoral College to protect the minority vote,
Right.
From larger states taking over.
Right.
And isn't that the very end of the Electoral College, so that as it stands, take control of.
Right, right. And I mean, in some ways, I was thinking about this. In some ways, you can consider the Electoral College like a redistribution of electoral votes or electoral welfare, right? So the Vermont, which has maybe 600,000 people, is always going to have 3 electoral votes, right? Regardless of the size. In California, you know, so California and Texas and New York, well, Florida and then New York, in a sense, they give away electoral votes to these smaller states to make sure that they have a voice. But I would also say that for the presidency, it's a national election, and I think that the nation should elect the president. And I don't think we're no longer governed by our states like that, because also you do have the U.S. Senate that protects minority rights when it comes to small states. Even in the House of Representatives, every state is guaranteed at least one representative. So I do think that smaller states are continually protected in our system.
Was there ever a time where the popular vote was focusing where we had it? Because it seems like every time that we have elected a president, it seems to be the popular vote goes for the Democratic candidate, and then the Republican, end up winning the presidency.
That's okay. But what I would say, to be fair, is that political parties change over time. So the Republican Party, so for example, in 1888, the Republican Party in 1888 is quite different from today. For example, Harrison ran on a high tariff campaign. I would say since Ronald Reagan, you would not have any Republican run on a high tariff campaign, and it was Cleveland, the Democrat, running on low tariff. So it would be like today, well, I guess today it's bad, but generally the parties I think are different. But yeah, it does. I think that could be.
This is the only benefit to the Republican Party.
Yeah, well,
to have the electoral.
Right. I would say especially the last 16 years.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that could be a challenge too, because if you want an amendment to the Constitution, you have to have it passed by 2/3 of Congress and then 3/4 of the state. So if you have a lot of Republican legislatures and they feel that they're being benefited by this change, then they won't vote for it.
But it's like you said, if you change it for the popular vote, then the Democrat would actually benefit from that.
Maybe, but if we go back to the 80s with Ronald Reagan won California, he won New York, right? It wasn't like Carter, Mondale, and Dukakis were these like powerhouse politicians that everyone was running for, right? So I think politics can change over time, and I think that yes, right now you're absolutely right. If there was an electoral college, Al Gore would have been president in 2000, and then Hillary Clinton would be president in 2016. But then in 20 years, 30 years, you don't know how parties can change.
And I think your question goes to a very important point, because again, this would ultimately have to originate with politicians, right, who'd have to instigate the change. And with all the flaws of the Electoral College, at least from a political perspective, they understand the institution, they understand how it works. Politicians are loath to enter policies and design new institutions where they don't know what the outcomes necessarily going to be. So again, your point's well taken that it could be designed to be beneficial to a party today, but may actually go against that party 20 years from then. And you mentioned Reagan. A classic case in point would be the 2-term limitation, right? That was created by Republicans in the aftermath of FDR, and it was the same Republicans that wished to repeal it during the Reagan administration so that he could run for a 3rd term. So politicians, they just don't know what the calculations necessarily are going to be with eliminating the Electoral College. So the easiest thing to do, don't do it.
Sure.
Do you foresee in the future that maybe the Electoral College will maybe choose their candidate and maybe the people can?
Oh, like a polar bureau? Like it's interesting because every so often there'll be congressional research and reports after a campaign. So in 1933 they did one, the 1932 campaign. And this is FDR, he won the popular vote, he won the Electoral College. And the person who was arguing before Congress, he felt that the idea of electors was just outdated. Like, he wanted to keep the Electoral College, and you know what was interesting? Because he understood that in the South, African Americans didn't have the right to vote, right? And so I think that nowadays that we don't, generally don't have that problem. Of course, there's problems with North Carolina and Texas, but so what he wanted to do was eliminate the electors at all, keep the electoral votes, but just do it as, just round it to the next decimal until someone gets the majority. And then, of course, after 1968, Richard Nixon thought about also abolishing the Electoral College. But it was the Southern politicians who said, we don't want California, we don't want the larger states to impose. Because again, in 1968, you're still going through the civil rights movement, you're going through problems of segregation, and sometimes what states want to do is continue those policies within their states, and they don't want to be told by the federal government what to do. But I mean, to your point, sorry, I went off a little tangent. I think that, my hope is that maybe in 30, 40 years, I think hopefully people can start talking and hopefully one day abolish the Electoral College or adopt the NPV plan. So where we can either, if it's not abolished, at least it just becomes something routine that's not bothering the popular vote. Any other?
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. This is a lot of food for thought. I think that I thought after the 2000 election, if there was ever an opportunity to really engage in thoughtful discussion about eliminating the Electoral College, I thought that was going to be the election. So I'm frankly rather pessimistic that we'll see the United States ever engage in this, but I think that Mike's given us a lot of food for thought, and certainly I'm hoping that at least there's more discussion about how we can perfect our imperfect democracy. So again, join me in thanking Mike for his presentation.
We're good.
Yeah.